sorry, Joe, Dismistifying the Mediumship. And I'm absolutely sure it's going to be a brilliant presentation. I'm glad that you're here. And Mr. José Mussi is the president of the Toronto Spititist Society. We are very, very happy to have you here. And I can't wait to see your presentation. So I will let you to introduce yourself with more details. And everybody, let's put our heads together for the
Thank you. As you probably know, this lecture is going to be in English. For those who are not understanding me, I can't help you much, but hopefully we all know that we'll be here for this in this room all day long with our English track of presentations. So as Mila said, I'm the president of the Toronto Spititist Society. Titles apart, it's not really important. I'm a fairly recent spiritist. I've been involved with spiritism for only about 4 years, which is just like kindergarten in terms of the studies. I'm curious of history and science. So when I was invited to do a presentation here about mediumship, I started to think what would be some neat ideas. So well, why don't we start from the reason that we're celebrating this year, the Medium's book, 150 years. Kardec was quite a avant-garde kind of person where he introduced all kinds of new ideas about old things. One of them was about mediumship. We know that mediums and mediumnic activities and capabilities have existed throughout history, but never before had someone actually tried to define it and actually give a name to it. There was all kinds of different mystic interpretations about our ability to communicate with those spirits that are not incarnated. And Allan Kardec, in his Medium's book, for which we're celebrating 150 years, provides a very clear and simple definition. He says that every individual who senses the influence of spirits to any degree is a medium. This faculty is inherent to humankind. Thus we can state that everyone is a medium to a certain degree. So with these two paragraphs, Kardec just destroyed all of the mystic cloud that until then existed around the definition of these phenomena and these abilities that many, many humans over the centuries and years have demonstrated. So I thought, why not look back prior to Kardec's definition? Let's start from early civilization and try to demystify the concept of spiritism. And the best way that I can think of doing that is showing how common and how frequent we saw them across the ages, across the various regions of the world, regardless of one's origin, ethnic group, religion, level of education, gender, age. So my presentation today is entitled Dismistifying Mediumship, and why not a tale of saints and witches? Because until Kardec, you fell in one of these two categories if you were a medium. We're going to hear the story, very brief, because we have a short period today, of 21 individuals. Before we begin looking at them, and I'm going to talk about mediumships and mediums, let's have just a quick introduction of what do we mean by these two terms. Left-hand side, out of the medium's book, we identified some of the key types of mediums that have been categorized by Allan Kardec. He defined physical effect mediums, sensitive and impressionable mediums, those who can hear, the hearing mediums, or those who can see, those who perform their abilities where they're kind of in a trance state, somnambulistic. Those mediums that can heal. Those who have other kind of phenomenal capabilities, either through psychographic or what's called thematographical mediums. I'm not going to go into details. This is kind of a plug for those who don't know what those types of mediums are, to get a copy of the medium's book, and you'll find each one is very, very well defined inside the book. Now, obviously, as we're going back, and we're going to go really back in time, these terms did not exist. So we have identified some of these people, not through some kind of category of types of mediums they were, but through their abilities, through their capabilities. And the most common ones that we've used are the ability for clairvoyance, to see things that are happening in other places, for example. Divinations or premonitions, see the future. Levitation, that's pretty cool. I wish I could levitate. But we're going to see throughout history there are many recorded cases of special mediums who were able to levitate. Magnetic healing. Well, this is very common today. Through our abilities and through our passes, we perform a little bit every time we come to a spiritist group or spiritist center for our passes. The bipolarity or bilocation is some people have been shown to be able to, while incarnated, be in two places at the same time. And finally, the most common one that has attracted so much attention, especially in Brazil and in other parts of the world, psychography. The ability to write things, receive messages, and put them down on paper, something someone is dictating to you, ideas, stories, facts, or even language that the actual medium had no ability, no chance of having knowledge or prior knowledge of that information. So all of these are the types of abilities that we look for when trying to characterize someone as a medium. Obviously, we want to go back to ages where writing was not yet developed. It was very limited to a very small cast of people. Records were not necessarily precise. So we rely a lot on verbal stories that have come down to us through the ages or through some of the holy books. So are we ready to start? Can we start our time machine and really, really go back in time? We're going to start with stories from our ancient times. And as I said, our history or our records that come from those ages are very sketchy, maybe contradictory. But nevertheless, they do paint a picture of some extraordinary individuals who have changed the direction of humanity through their mediumnic capabilities. I'm going to go through 21 stories. I'm sure that most of you are going to be familiar with the majority of them. But I bet you there's going to be one or two that you've never heard about. And these are also, you're going to find, extraordinary people that lived in difficult times and has helped us reach where we are today as a civilization. The first one is going back to 1800 years before Christ. And it's Hammurabi. Hammurabi was the first king of the what's called the Babylonian Empire. There was Babylon before, and we know of Babylon through our writings in the Bible. But he was the first one who really created and was leader of the bigger Babylon Empire. And what's so special about Hammurabi is that he created the first known written set of laws. Right? The Hammurabi Code, or the Code of Hammurabi, was the first record that we have of a legal structure that told people how they had to behave in civilization. That's in itself extraordinary, and even though the code itself was very harsh and very punitive as compared to our laws today, nevertheless, they did provide a vast vision of what people had to do, from commercial dealings to crimes and punishment. You know, it was still starting the evocation, an eye for an eye and a hand for a hand. So in the code, if you murdered somebody's child, that person had the right to kill your own child as well in retribution, as punishment to you. So very tough. But what's unique about this is that Hammurabi, when he goes to his people and gives this, being such a sophisticated set of laws, you know, we have 282 laws that were put together. He described them as having been given to him by God. It's the first record of a psychographic event where God has come to a person and has given him the directions of the laws. The god was obviously a Babylonian god, and there is some controversy where this was the god Shamash, or another one called Marduk. Most people think it's Marduk. But nevertheless, here is the god, the king saying that I myself have to obey these laws because they don't come from me. They have been given to me by God. Quite extraordinary. And this predates the Mosaic Code, the code that was created by Moses. That, lo and behold, is our next character in the story. I think most people have heard of Moses. They know the stories of Moses, of how he was commanded by God to lead his people, to abandon his career as a king or a pharaoh in Egypt, and lead the Jewish people out of Egypt into the promised land. Somewhere along the way, he too receives now instructions from God in terms of the Ten Commandments. So I'm going to be going through these stories, and I'm going to start putting in some of what we have learned from Spiritism into kind of reflecting how these same things were happening back then. One of the things that we know is that the spirits are very stubborn, especially with people who don't listen and don't want to get their lessons. They insist, they repeat, they do it. Well, Moses receives the Ten Commandments after 40 days and 40 nights, comes down, sees that while he was away, the whole house went messy, right? Everybody is back to adoring the pagan gods, the golden cow. He has a fit. He tells people, those who still believe in him, to kill everybody else. And he actually destroys the tablets with the Ten Commandments. Right? He's so infuriated that he basically goes against the very laws that he was bringing down, because he told his followers to kill all of those who were not obeying his rules. Well, God was insistent, makes him go back for another 40 days and 40 nights, and again dictates to him the Ten Commandments. And this time he puts it in the tablets, and he must now take those and rule by those laws. So again, this is a clear example of psychography in terms of being able to receive the words, his messages, from the afterlife. And again, I'm not trying to be contradictory to whether the spirits was deemed to be a god, or is it the real God, and how the message came to Moses as a human, as an incarnate. The idea around mediumship is that he has been selected to receive this message that is coming from the invisible world. Now, Moses had other mediumnic abilities. This was just kind of the highlight of his life, for which he then moves on, and he actually creates the Mosaic law based on the Ten Commandments. Now, these are laws that was created by him, but still he would push them as the desire of God. He also had the ability of spiritual healing. There are cases, stories in the Bible where he helped heal people, and obviously all the premonitions that was given to him about the plagues in Egypt, that things would come and destroy and attack people before he was allowed to. So Moses, I I put a date around 1400 before Christ. There's some controversy whether it's 1300, 1500, 1400. The dates are not very clear because even in the Old Testament, the Pharaoh from which he is finally allows him to leave is never identified by name. So we don't know for sure who is the Pharaoh at the time of Moses. But maybe could have been Amenhotep the Fourth, also known as Akhenaten, and we do know better the date is about 1300 before Christ. He was a kind of a famous by relation to us. We know him as the father of Tutankhamun. He was also married to Nefertiti. We probably know these names more than we know his name. But what was important about him is that, as some of you may know, the Egyptian religion was very detailed in the description of the life after death. It talked about you dying, going into a boat, having to pay a little toll to get into the spiritual world. However, back to this notion of the mysticism that existed and started to grow at this time, only the priests were allowed to have an insight and a communication into that afterlife communication. And obviously that gathered a lot of power for them. And they often had as much power as the Pharaoh himself. Well, Akhenaten actually went against that tradition of that established power by having visions that, in contrast to what existed at the time when they had many different gods which they prayed. Every kind of priest group created their own god, and they created their own kind of rituals around that god. He was promoting monotheism, one god. Right? And he chose, and his vision was around the god Ra, also called Akhenaten. That's why he actually changed his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten. The Akhenaten at the name, at the end, represents the god that he was following. So he tried to transform Egyptian society by introducing monotheism. While he was alive, he was able to impose this, but after his death, things went back to normal. Right? So this is also very typical that we find throughout the history of mediums, that some of them are just way ahead of their time. But nevertheless, their message, their attempt, their vision around the transformation of our social relationships somehow continue. Now, from that point on, for a long time, we see that there are many recorded instances of the continued communications between certain human beings and the spiritual world. And these people were deemed to be very special. They became mystic and powerful, just like was happening in Egypt. The people who had the ability to communicate with the dead were given a very special religious status within their society. And maybe the best representative of this was the Oracle of Delphi. Delphi is a city in the Greek Empire, and for many centuries it was the site of religious temples. And among them, the one that was most well known was Pythia. Now, Pythia was not a single person, because they were women that were deemed to have the ability to speak with the gods. And they changed. As one Pythia was dying, another one came on. They were still all called Pythia, right? She became, whoever was at the time, very influential. Emperors, generals, wealthy people would come looking for premonitions, looking for direction and guidance of how to do their lives, where to go to war, when not to go to war, where to build a city and not build a city. And established a very strong base of religious influence over the life of people. Now, this was happening over many centuries. And, we might ask, is this kind of a unique situation that happened in Greece? Early civilizations, tribes were coming together, creating cities. Our whole social relationship was changing. And of course, it would be silly to think that it was only happening in Greece. As we also know from our Spiritist teaching, is that when spirits are transforming or help the progression of a world, they will often send similar messages or similar mechanisms in many different places at the same time. And a simple view of back then of other cultures, other societies, which had similar notions of priests and soothsayers, were recorded everywhere from China with the I Ching. Those who don't know, the I Ching is a book. Actually, it is a guide for mediunic communication, for foreseeing future. Tibet, right? Tibet has also a very long and established tradition of oracles. In fact, the Dalai Lama must consult the oracle once a year as a tradition. Hinduism. So we're going all over the map, not only geographically, but also from a religious perspective, seeing that all of them were experiencing individuals or somehow were able to view and see things that others could not. Now, we know that among them could be quite a few of charlatans and people who were not experiencing. But I guess the point is, as we see this happening in the Norse methodology, where one king brings the other, a severed head of another god, and uses that head as the oracle now. It's kind of gruesome, but still probably effective. The Celts, the Druids, had essentially established themselves as the guides of between the material and the invisible world. The Mayas, also lots of records of the influence and the power of the priests. You find it even in Hawaii. We have records of established oracles at that place. So we see that this is not something that happened. It was not a specific cultural thing. It was not something that was unique to a specific religion. In fact, it was happening. Now, the simultaneously here is spanning maybe 6 to 10 centuries. Early development of our civilization. Everywhere in the world, we're growing. So now we start to understand why spiritually we talk about evolution of the world, not just of individual societies. Things are happening, apparently disconnected, apparently at different paces, but if we take a bigger picture, we see that they're happening with a pattern, with a plan, with a consistency that allows mistakes, allows different speeds and abilities of different societies to incorporate these ideas faster or slower. So this takes us now to a great watershed, a great transformation. Now the second revelation comes with Jesus. And certainly the Bible and Jesus is a fantastic source of dozens of mediunic stories. And because of that, because it merits a presentation on its own, I'm not going to talk about Jesus today. I'm going to focus more on the mortals, in the incarnated humans, right? But I do encourage anybody who is interested in this topic to look at a number of presentations that talk about mediunic characteristics of the Bible. But Jesus started a trend now, right? He has introduced new ideas. He has introduced a new gospel to the world. And then he leaves us. And now it's up to us to take that. But we're not alone. We're not going to be on that track alone. our guides, our spirits will help us with that, with more stories, more individuals coming and continuing the work that had been started then. One of them was a fellow by Apollonius of Tyana. He comes in right after Jesus, around the same time. They were very likely, and again, because we don't know exactly the records, they were alive together at the same time. But Apollonius was born a little bit later. And he was a Greek philosopher. The Greek Empire was expanding very much, so he was actually born in what is today Turkey. And he was also a preacher. Some people find a lot of similarities with what he was doing with what Jesus did, not obviously in the quality or the extent of the content, but he was also preaching all kinds of ideas around spiritual life, about our purpose here. And he would wander the Turkish, the Greek Empire, but the Turkish region, preaching these ideas. And he had followers similar to Jesus. He had his own set of apostles. And a couple of records exist of some of the stories and some of the ideas that Apollonius was preaching. And from it, we know that he had several mediumnic capabilities. The first one was clairvoyance, right? He was able, one story tells, to predict the death of the emperor in Rome, right? A tyrant which he despised because of the oppression that the Romans had on the religious thinking. And, in those days, no internet, phones, no TV. So he basically told his followers that the emperor had died, right? Ephesus. Well, in Ephesus, right? He was talking about, who was the, I forgot the name of the emperor. Nevertheless, several days later comes the news that the emperor had been killed. The very same day that he had told his followers that he had happened. And there's also stories that he would come back and appear to at least one of his followers. And interesting enough, the one that had the greatest difficulty in accepting the notion of afterlife. So he shows up to him in a vision. But Apollonius was not the only one. Records from the early days of Christianism are very, very difficult to come by. But one story that most people believe and have a greater certainty is about Vibia Perpetua. Has heard voices to tell her to believe in the words of Christ, to promote Christianism, to educate people about the message that was given. She came from a wealthy family, as interesting enough, a lot of the people we're going to see today have come from wealthy families. So she would not back down. She was so fervent in her belief because she would tell folks that she had the visions and she had the voices that would tell her all of these things, that she could not decry, she could not renege in her vision. And for that, she was taken into an arena with wild animals and other gladiators, and she was basically killed with 4 other people, other Christians, early Christians. So we see a pattern that in these early days, we see communications trying to ensure that there will be people following and listening and opening their hearts to the message of Jesus, even in places where that belief would threaten their own lives. So people like Vibia has been recorded in our history as those who have, for whatever reason, became more popular or more well-known. But we know that hers is only one of many similar stories that happened throughout the early first couple of centuries as Christianism was being established especially across the Middle East. So now we jump ahead a bit. So we're now up to the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is a time of great, interesting enough, great changes, but also of dark periods, where folks are entrenching, they are become harsher, they become less tolerant of one another, they're pushing their ideas. Power is being consolidated through the creation of greater wealth and holdings and lands. So we're going to see now that some key characters come about and help maintain the moral identity of our civilization in that period. We begin with a lady called Hildegard von Bingen. She is one, for example, that I had not heard before doing this study. And she was born in Germany. She came from a wealthy family as well. And what was unique about her, that starting at age 8, she started having visions. And these visions would change her entire life. She would describe how she could see these things. Even with her eyes open, she knew it wasn't coming from her eyes. She would describe how the visions were inside her soul, her internal eyes. So she starts describing what we kind of understand today as the perispirit, where we are represented both with internal and external capabilities. And she could at that time recognize that what she was hearing and viewing was not coming from her ears, from her eyes, not the external ones. She describes this in a book called Spititist. She had 26 visions that she described in a very detailed manner. Very incredible. And she makes a prediction. This is interesting because now we know what's happening with our world. Back in the 2nd century, she said that one day we'll see a regenerated world where angels will return with confidence to stay among men. So if we understand angels to be the spirits, and the regenerated world is our world in transition, it's kind of saying that her prediction is starting to happen now. A few years later. She was also well known, she says that a lot of her writings were psychographed. She would receive these messages and she would put them down. The kind of an old painting of her would actually describe these kind of tentacles coming down on her. And these things are the way that the information, the story, the words are flowing into her while she would write them down. So this is probably one of the earliest drawings of a psychography taking place. She was also known for her healing, right? She was one of the early preachers of a holistic way of healing the body through the spiritual improvements in one's life. Yeah, she was an early Renaissance person. She wrote books, she wrote songs, she wrote poems. She was the full Monty, really. She had everything in terms of all of these capabilities that came across with her. We now move from Germany to Italy. During a small period of time, we see a tremendous occurrence of very spiritual, very unique people. And these names are probably very familiar to everyone here. Saint Francis of Assisi, right? A blessed person. He is wealthy, comes from a wealthy family. He's still trying to find himself. He actually goes to war. He goes and fights people. So he is no different than anybody else in terms of his peers. And then one day he hears a voice from God. God tells him to give up that life and help restructure his church. And the words he's here many, many times, repeating over and over again to them, is, don't you see that my church is falling down? Go and restore it to me. So it is a recognition that things were not going well, that the people were losing that connection to Jesus, to the message that Jesus brought about, and that St. Francis should dedicate his life to make that change. Right? He very, very active in restructuring, creating the Franciscan order. He also helped the Order of St. Clare, we're going to talk about it in just a minute. And he is also the first known recorded case of stigmata. Right? He was praying in a mountain, and he had a vision. This picture here is that representation of the vision of what's called a seraph. This is this angel here that has 6 wings, comes in and gives him the 5 stigmatas, the 5 injuries of Jesus to him, as a representation and as a remembrance of his faith and his continuing dedication to Jesus. Incredible. Well, at the same time, St. Anthony, St. Antonio, Brazilians, St. Anthony of Padua, another very spiritual person, right? He's Portuguese, right? He's born in Portugal. He comes across St. Francis. And he also gives up his life of wealth for one of poverty. He has many accomplishments in terms of promoting the Christian faith in Portugal and then in Italy. But he also he had several recorded experiences as a medium. One was of that Bible writing. He was praying, studying in St. Pierre de Angera in Italy. He is actually preaching. And then suddenly, he was also in another choir session, in another lecture, 2 different places. And people recorded that he was in the pulpit talking, but he was totally motionless. The voice was coming out of him, but nothing would move. Must have been quite an experience for those who were listening to his preaching. And finally, it was also recorded that he was in Padua, Italy. And a few hours later, he shows up in Lisbon. Now, this is 13th century. You don't go from Italy, hop on a plane, and get to Lisbon overnight. In fact, it would take 3 months at that time for the journey. But he shows up to help defend some of his relatives. And this is recorded in the legal records that he was there as a witness to help defend his relatives against accusations. Another blessed person, all 3 knew each other. Imagine this, St. Clare of Assisi. I think many of you would know Clare's story. She founded the Order of the Poor Ladies, now called the Poor Clares. Very saintly person, also dedicated her life to religion. She lets go of all of her, obviously all her belongings. And many records of her having visions, even obviously to join and follow this path was started with a vision. She had premonitions. Many people would come to her to help them see what they should be doing and get counsel. So 3 fantastic individuals who were sharing the same moment in life, this earth, helping, as God said, bring back His church, His religion, His message to what Christ had given. Christ had said essentially this, that we need to help those who are weakest. We should not be striving for the material wealth as our final goal in life. At the end of the Middle Ages, we have continuing, regardless in spite of this work done by these saints, we still start into some dark period. This is reflected in some ways by Dante Alighieri. He is known for writing maybe one of the greatest literary tomes in history, called the Divine Comedy. Very complex, very difficult to read. It is a detailed description of hell, purgatory, and paradise. It provides scientific, provides narrative, it provides detailed descriptions of the invisible world. To the point that many people believe, based on some of his own writing, that Dante was actually allowed to go there during his sleep. As we know, as we sleep, our spirit is liberated. And often, where we go, we don't bring those memories necessarily back with us. But as a medium, he was allowed to continue and go there several times and bring back the memories of those visits. And that these are what is described in the Divina Comedy. The medieval Inquisition is in full bloom. Here is a dangerous time to be a medium. If you did not follow the doctrines, the dogmas, the orders, and the absolute obedience to the church, you are in danger of being labeled a heretic or a witch. And if you were not publicly disavow those ideas, you had one destiny: to be burned in public. So we can see that during that climate, during this culture, those who had this natural immune capabilities were either going to expose themselves and risk being killed, or they were going to suppress it, hide it, not tell anyone. Imagine if you were a parent of an 8-year Hildegard at this time that started to see visions. You would spank her until she confessed that she's not seeing anything, because you know that she goes on that path and starts telling people what she's seeing, that she's going to be being a witch. But we don't see many records of great mediums happening at this time. But I would say that's not very surprising. But there is one great exception. Joan of Arc. Young girl, uneducated, from a small village, born in a peasant's family. She receives visions that she should take the word of Christ and help the king become king. Now imagine, she was, I think when she started seeing these visions, she was around 12, 13. Imagine a 12 or 13-year-old country girl, farmer, receiving this. How is she going to do this? Well, you know the story. She did it. She is so convincing in her details, in her description of her visions and of her mission, that she actually succeeds in helping Charles VII become king. And this is a time of the 100-Year War between England and France. And because of this whole monarchy things, there were English descendants as kings in France and vice versa. It was a bit of a mess. So Charles was actually English descendant, but he became king of France. And she led armies into war when she was 16. She walked, and she, with her knowledge, with her vision, she brings Charles into power, only to be betrayed later, as she is captured in one of these battles. And instead of protecting her, Charles basically gives her to the British. And she is asked to denounce her faith, her visions. She does not. She wears her uniform back again, defying authority, and then she, as a witch, is burned at the age of 19. Imagine what you did between 16 and 19, and try to compare with this. I saw an interesting comparison that some people try to identify some kind of mental disease in Joan during that time. Schizophrenics and so forth. And a great scientist, a French scientist, says, if this is mental disease, and this is what mental disease can do for our country, let us all be crazy, like Joanna. Finally, we come to modern times. And modern here is relative. This is everything that's happened just before the transformation that will occur with Allan Kardec coming in the 19th century. So this will take us between the 16th and the 18th century. We have 7 great individuals here. And a different type of unique capabilities show up now. We're starting to get into the Renaissance. Some of those darker periods are over. We will have the Spanish Inquisition about this time, but in other places we see a number of individuals, especially presenting capabilities around levitation. The first one was São Peter of Alcântara, Portuguese, wealthy. We've heard that story before. Somebody born in a very wealthy family, and then he has a message and is taken into the religious life. And Peter was totally dedicated to his mission, right? He was said to sleep only 1 or 2 hours a day. Everything else was dedicated to praying, meditation, and helping the poor. And he would meditate and he would pray so strongly that often in his state of ecstasy, and ecstasy was a term used when he went into that kind of great bliss around coming from this prayer, he would levitate. Many records of this. One of them was recorded in the story of 2 nobles, the Marquis of Abel and the Count of Aragon. And they were looking for him, and he wasn't in his room, where he slept, which was very small, said to be about 4 square meters. So that's barely enough for a bed. They go into the chapel, and they see, well, they first go in, and they don't see him, and they look up, and there he is. He is at the top of the ceiling of the chapel. And the way they describe it is they look up and saw him levitating, but so high above the ground as to be rising to heaven. The nobles saw him surrounded by bright lights, most likely his spiritual aura, and all around innumerable varieties of beautiful little birds flying around him, evolved by the sounds of gentle music. Now that's an experience. Everything else is just not measured up to. And Saint Teresa also has an autobiography, and she knew St. Peter, and she tells of many different other mediumnic stories around his capabilities of performing miracles and prophecies. Many premonitions. He once told a mother who was looking to marry her daughter that she would marry a very noble person. But she said that's not possible because that man just married a very young wife. He's not going to be available. My daughter needs to marry over the next few years. And in fact, the young wife gets sick and dies, and he doesn't marry the original girl. Also, he was walking down the street and sees a friend, and he warns them that he will die soon. A friend was healthy, young, died this very same night. So these are all anecdotes and stories of people and how they would, throughout their life, not once, but consistently have these powers, these unique experiences recorded as they go through life. Saint Teresa of Avila. She was, she was a nun, right? She This was quite a lady. She was a reformer. She was against establishment. She wanted to bring folks back into the true kind of dedication to God through prayer. She was a very strong advocate of prayer. And she actually describes, she wrote a book that describes what I would say the first guide for becoming a medium. How through prayer you will be evolving into 4 different stages that she describes as the mental prayer, the prayer of quiet, devotion of union, and finally the devotion of ecstasy. And interesting enough, each one of these stages are represented by how much you're still yourself and how much now you have been transformed into the Spirit of God. So early on, right, even the prayer of quiet, we're lost into what is God, but we still preserve our own faculties such as memory, reason, and imagination. And these are not yet unlinked from our material bindings. Till we reach the devotion to ecstasy, which our conscious of our body disappears. That is the essential description of the ecstasy, of the bliss. And at that point, she would levitate. So another example of levitation happening around the same time, very interesting. This is one lady I never heard of her. Maria de Jesus de Agreda. And she has probably one of the most unique and detailed record of Bible writing. She lived in Spain, never left Spain, and she preached to Indians in what is now New Mexico and Arizona. She describes in very detail how she was surrounded by people that she had never seen before, speaking a language that she could not understand. And this did not happen once, it happened consistently to the point that she becomes to teach these people about Christians. And this was the local, I think the Navajo Indians at the time. They had not had any contact with the Spanish conquerors yet. And when the first missionaries reach them, they are surprised to know that they already know the word of the Lord. And they describe the lady who is teaching them. And one of the missionaries has a picture of a nun, not her, but someone from a similar order. And they point to her and says, yes, she is dressed exactly like this. And then when they come back to Spain, they were able to confirm that it was Maria that was doing this preaching halfway across the world. She also wrote a book called The Mystical City of God, and she claims it was psychographed from the Virgin Mary. 8 books. Talks about Mary, her relationship to God, the works that her son, her incarnated son, performed, right? And also, what's crucial, the doctrines given by the Holy Mother of how to acquire true sanctity, how to become a saint or a pure spirit. No, I don't know. Saint Joseph of Cupertino. He was called the Friar Donkey. His name was Giuseppe Maria, born in Italy, very slow-witted. You know, those kind of, comes from a very poor family, totally uneducated. He is what we would call, you know, a slow mental person. He could not do more than one thing at a time. But one day he finds a job working with the friars, but he's too slow to actually be part of the studies of the Bible and the religion. So they take him to take care of the donkeys. And he's there happy, and he's very happy in his little world. And he's one day in a procession for St. Francis, and he's praying, and he's getting into some kind of from a state, and to his greatest surprise, he starts to levitate in the middle of the parade. everybody is astonished. They look at him, and they couldn't believe what they're seeing. One of his friars, who are his kind of superiors, shouts at him and tells him to come down, and he does come down, but he's so embarrassed that he runs home to his mommy because he was embarrassed of what he just did. He did not understand. But from that moment on, he would levitate at the simplest notion. He would levitate when he was praying. He would levitate when people would talk about the name of Jesus of Mary. He was levitating so much that his superiors were telling him, stop it. You're interfering with it. You just keep levitating all the time. You can't do that. But he can't control it, right? So one of the most important events, he did this in front of the Pope on Urban VIII. When he bent down to kiss the Pope, he's levitating. And the Pope is telling him to come down, he doesn't come down. And he doesn't say, there's nothing I can do, I just levitate. He could not understand. He had no control or understanding of his mediumnic capabilities. But it did bring in hundreds of people who wanted to meet him and understand the simple person that had such an incredible power. And there are some stories that were more difficult to confirm about it also having the kids. To finish it off with St. Alphonsus, Maria de Ligori, another Catholic saint, right? What else can we... So he was a very rigorous, a very disciplined religious. And he was very known for his healing capabilities, his healing abilities. People would come for him to get cured. He also described the disincarnation of Pope Clement XIV. This was very interesting because he was already sick. He was an old man. He was sick. And so he prays in the morning, goes for a nap, and does not wake up for almost 48 hours. He's there, motionless. And nobody, all of the other priests around him, the friars, are worried that he might be dead. He wasn't dead, he was still alive, but he was motionless. He wakes up, he sees all of the surprise around him of people looking and saying, what happened? Who were you? And he says, don't you know that I was tending to the Pope who had just died? And in fact, the moment that he woke up, they would find out later, is the exact moment that the Pope disincarnated. Now he was very humble, right? He had all this reputation about performing miracles. So there's an interesting quote from him. He says, some believe that I am a saint and that I perform miracles. If this were true, I would start by healing myself, who is but a useless fool. So that's where we're going to stop our time travel. We'll continue, come back for the next Spititist weekend, and we'll see how this story ends. But let me tell you that I did not put this all together myself. In fact, I based most of the presentation on these two books by Hugo Lacerda Filho. And I chose these books because, unfortunately, they have not been translated to English yet. So I thought this was a good opportunity for those who don't read Portuguese to hear about all of the stories. Not all of the people here are reflected in the book, but a lot of material did come with them. Those who do read Portuguese, I would recommend. It's a very interesting history lesson. It goes into a lot more details about the different transformations of religions and spiritual beliefs around the world. Like I said, some of these names I did not know. So it's always, if you have a spare time, if you're curious, look them up. Find out a little bit more. There's a lot more. Each one of them would merit a whole lecture on their own for their stories, for how they impacted those around them and impacted humanity as a whole. And also clear demonstration that Kardec was not telling something, a new truth. He was just putting down in words a truth that had already existed since we are incarnated. That these mediumnic abilities are not the source of mysticism, of special people, gifted, chosen ones to be mystics, to be mediums. They are all part of us to different levels. We should all embrace and experience and try to evolve these capabilities.